So I see we have 36 people that have joined us already, so welcome. We're just going to wait a little bit until we get closer to a couple minutes after 6 while people sign on. So welcome, welcome. We're so glad you're here. We're so excited about tonight. Up to 40 participants, so welcome. We'll get going here in a few minutes. So welcome to the folks that just signed on. Where one, my sister says, hi, Kathy. Okay, at 6 o'clock, I'll be more professional. All right, we've hit the 50-person mark. So this is fabulous for Wyoming and thereabouts. We'll wait a few minutes, make sure everyone can get on okay. So we'll just wait another minute and then we'll get going here. Pretty excited, been working on this for a while. So glad you all are here. We're really lucky tonight to have a fabulous group of folks speaking to us. Still have folks signing on. We'll wait another minute. My cell phone says 6:02. Okay, well, while people are getting on, I'll start the introduction a little slow to get going while the couple of you still get signed on. I'm Madeline Dalrymple, and I'm a coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby, and I want to welcome you to our panel of University of Wyoming economists, and to all who have joined tonight. Thank you, thank you. So glad to see you here. How are we doing on folks? Let me just check how we're doing. All right. This is a great group of folks that joined tonight, and I know why, because this is a great group of folks that we'll be hearing from. So let me say a couple words about Citizens Climate Lobby, and then we'll get going. And I promise it's just a couple words, so don't fret. I'm state coordinator for the Wyoming chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby. Citizens Climate Lobby is a nonprofit, nonpartisan national organization, and our grassroots volunteer encourage national policies to address climate change. Volunteers in almost every congressional district have developed working relationships with our congressional senators and our representatives. We have about 200,000 supporters nationwide, and the organization is growing internationally. And we have about 500 supporters in Wyoming. So we're super duper excited to host tonight a panel of University of Wyoming economists. They're experts in Wyoming, experts in energy, and experts in the Wyoming energy economy. And we're very pleased to provide a venue for them to share their insights on how world events and climate shifts and market forces are affecting Wyoming now and in the future. So we'll get going here. Brian Keel is the moderator for the panel discussion. Brian is a principal with Keiko ISOM, and he leads the firm's Federal Affairs Service Area. Operating at the intersection of agriculture, environment, and government policy, Brian brings together people and organizations with differing interests and aligns them toward a common goal. He achieves this by engaging those affected, building coalitions, and providing platforms for their individual and collective voices to be heard. Kathy Kint is a moderator, and she is a member of the Wyoming Citizens Climate Lobby team, and she will be monitoring participant questions throughout the session tonight. So, Brian?
Great. Well, thank you, Madeline, and thank you all for being with us today. It's a great honor to be able to moderate this illustrious panel. As Madeline indicated, my name is Brian Keel. I'm with a national agriculture business advisory firm called Keiko ISOM. And when I was asked to moderate this panel, I quickly said yes, because when you think about agriculture and you think about the implications of climate change on agriculture, it's very clear this is a topic that we need to take seriously and that we need to address. When you think about society and how we have built our cities next to places where we have water, we've irrigated our fields, or we've developed agriculture based on natural weather cycles. When those weather cycles get disrupted, it can harm agriculture, it can harm business, it can harm cities and people. And so this is a super important conversation for the state of Wyoming. It's a critical conversation for the entire planet. And it's just a great honor to be here. I would like to thank the Wyoming Citizens Climate Lobby for sponsoring this event and pulling it together, a real service to our state. And obviously thanks to the University of Wyoming economists who we'll hear from today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. A couple of quick housekeeping items. We are recording this session today, and that recording will be made available to all the participants and folks who have registered for this event. And then second, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can put a question in there at any time. We'll take questions at the end of the town hall, but go ahead and put in questions as you think about them. One thing I would ask is that if you are a reporter, please indicate in your Q&A box that you are a reporter and what outlet you are with. We'll try to prioritize those questions. If we have too many questions to get to, we want to make sure we're working and getting questions answered by the media. I see that Barb has her hand up. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not, Barb. If not, you can click the raise hand button again and it should take you down. Okay, with that, we're going to introduce our panelists. And what I want to do, I really am hoping that tonight will be a conversation between these panelists as opposed to a series of presentations. I think that'll be much more enjoyable to be able to have a little bit of give and take and a little bit free flow, a little bit informal perhaps. So I'm going to introduce our panelists one at a time, and I'm going to ask them initially to reflect on how their career and their area of expertise informs their view of climate change and its impact on Wyoming. So first, we're going to start by introducing Professor Robert Godby. He currently serves as the interim dean of the College of Business at the University of Wyoming. He is also an associate professor in the economics department at UW and a Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative faculty fellow. He serves as an adjunct faculty member with the MBA program at Pforzheim University in Germany. So Professor Godby, it's really an honor to have you on this call. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I'd like you to maybe just by way of introduction of yourself, tell us a little bit about your special expertise in economics and how that informs the way you think about climate and its impact on Wyoming. Professor Godby.
Well, thank you for having us here. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. And when you talk about my expertise, I guess I have to go back into my background. Certainly it's not as distinguished as some of our panelists here, but I've been privileged to be colleagues with two of the three for over 25 years now. And I would say that, my individual background, 25 years ago, I was just finishing as a graduate student looking at environmental policy, and my specific area of focus was really trying to develop and design environmental economic incentives to affect environmental policy. So the specific things that I looked at were things like designing permit markets for things like pollution, and of course carbon credits were an idea that was being talked about a lot at the time. This was around the time of the Kyoto Protocol being developed. So that's 25 years ago. And in studying that, went looking for my first permanent job, and the University of Wyoming stood out as a place that had distinguished itself in environmental economics and policy, natural resource policy for decades. And it was actually, some of the colleagues that are on this panel, Chuck and Jay, who had already been at the department for a while. And, it was their reputation that really attracted me to Wyoming. Theirs and others, a retired colleague in our department named Tom Crocker was another person that I'd read a lot about. So it was an honor to get to meet these people. So 25 years ago, I came from Canada down to Wyoming. And it's been an amazing ride since, but, so how is my expertise kind of allowed or informed kind of my thinking around climate change? Well, it kind of starts with that training, but it also starts with kind of Wyoming's problems. As I became more involved in policy in the state of Wyoming and the region, I really began to focus on energy. And of course, climate change primarily is considered, or at least thought about, as caused by fossil fuels. And of course, our state is incredibly dependent on the extraction of fossil fuels, like no other really in the country. And so my expertise is really kind of focused on developing policies, or at least considering ideas of how we might adapt to a world where fossil fuels are used much less than they have been, what that means for the state, what we could do to change our economy to adapt to these circumstances and to create the opportunities that we all want to see for our kids and our families. So that's kind of a little bit about me. Don't know if it answers your question, Brian, but that's kind of where I land, and probably a little bit of how I got here.
No, I think that's super helpful and just what we were looking for. I think that helps people understand how you've come to the table and some of the expertise that you bring to the conversation. So thank you for that, Professor Godby. Next, we have Dr. Christelle Khalaf, an Associate Director at the Center of Business and Economic Analysis, and an affiliated faculty with the Department of Economics at the University of Wyoming. Prior to joining UW, Dr. Khalaf worked as an economist at Ohio's University Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Affairs. Dr. Khalaf, thank you so much for being with us today. It is an honor, and please tell us a little bit about your background and how it informs the way that you look at climate change issues.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So as you mentioned, I'm Christelle Khalaf. I'm the Associate Director of a fairly new center here at the College of Business that was created to mainly provide applied research to different stakeholders across the state. And so I was trained as a labor economist, and then I worked in economic development specifically looking at the impact of the energy transition on Appalachian Ohio, with a special focus on workforce transitions. And so part of that work included determining synergies that would allow new emerging industries to leverage commonalities that they share with declining industries. And so here in Wyoming, I do sort of similar work. So when I think of the state's energy future, I'm often thinking through that lens of understanding business and workforce challenges and identifying and leveraging opportunities for economic development. So that's a little bit about me, and thank you for having me on today's panel.
Thank you, and great to have you here. We're really looking forward to the panel discussion. We're pleased to be joined by Professor Charles Mason. Charles is the H.A. Dave True Jr. Chair of Petroleum and Natural Gas Economics in the Department of Economics. He's also Associate Dean for Research in the College of Business at the University of Wyoming. He's currently an Associate Editor of the European Economic Review, Co-Editor of Economic Inquiry, Joint Editor-in-Chief of Strategic Behavior in the Environment, and Editor-in-Chief, Economics of Energy and Environmental Policy. He is a non-resident fellow at Resources for the Future, and given all of the work that he is doing, he does not sleep at all, but apparently works 24 hours a day. So Professor Mason, it's great to have you with us, and thank you for making time. Tell us a little about your background.
Thanks, Brian. I guess you've had conversations with my family. Well, I've been a resident of the state of Wyoming for just shy of 40 years. I've been interested in and studying, doing research on, and teaching classes related to energy economics, resource economics, and things that touch on those things for a good chunk of that time. Part of my experience involves opportunities that I've had to interact with scholars globally. That is tied in part to that list of journals that you articulated, as well as some other stuff that I've done in the past. Included in these adventures would be conversations, research visits, and the like that I've had with some very noteworthy, very prolific scholars in Europe. Much of that touches on, in one way or another, on climate change, on the role of energy in the economy for not just the state or the country, but globally, and how that might evolve over the course of the next several decades. As it happens, I have right now a class in energy economics, it's oil and gas economics, and a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say, I think, over the course of this conversation is probably tied to conversations I've had with my students there. And just as a side point here, one of the reasons I've lived here for 40 years is I'm a big fan of fly fishing. And so when you get to the point where you say, what does this all mean for the state? I'm going to talk about how I see this having affected fishing opportunities.
I can say firsthand that there are many days that I go out fishing and do not catch trout, but that may be more a commentary on my skill than climate change. It's hard to tell some days, but thank you for that. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we're pleased to be joined by Professor Jason Shogren, Strzok Chair of Natural Resource Conservation and Management in the Department of Economics. Jay's teaching and research over the years has focused on the behavioral and institutional underpinnings of economic policy, usually for environmental and natural resource issues. He worked on climate change in the White House for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Clinton-Gore administration, and he was a lead author of the scientific team in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, for the third assessment report. He also served on Wyoming's Environmental Quality Council. Professor Shogren, great to have you with us today. Tell us a little more about your background and how it informs the way you view climate change.
All right. Thanks again for having me. As an economist, I am a climate agnostic in the sense that I'm not trained to study the climate as a natural scientist or a life scientist. My job is to get the best information I possibly can from the natural sciences, blend them into an integrated system to understand the feedback loops between climate and people and climate, and to try to understand this ebb and flow between what we want and what we need. I came to Wyoming in '82 and got my PhD and left, and then came back in '95. And I joined the Council of Economic Advisors and as their economist, senior economist for environmental affairs. And quickly my portfolio got swept away by climate change, given the Kyoto Protocol was coming up. And my job was in the Clinton-Gore administration was basically, the skeptical economist about whether you could get it for free or whether it was going to be an economic Armageddon. And my job at that point was to sit in the middle and try to get as much information as I possibly could on both sides to understand where and what made sense and why. And that whole process hasn't changed over, since that time, 25 some years ago. That process is still the same, and that's how all of us economists, speaking broadly here, think about this problem in trying to identify all the hidden costs and all the hidden benefits and all the impacts that are visible and invisible today and off into the future, and not just for industry, but for consumers, and not just through the marketplace, but outside the marketplace. Climate change is such a huge problem in the sense of a scientific problem that spending time on the IPCC team, you get to understand how thousands of scientists who have dedicated their life to small increments of this question get together to come up with a quilt, essentially, of information that attempts to weave the best information possible, based on our models, based on our arguments. And it's you kind of hear, well, scientists disagree. Well, yeah, that's our job. Our job is to tear apart each other's work in a kind and gentle way, and to find the holes in these arguments so that once we come forward with our estimate, it's as good as it gets. And I enjoy that process. And I think it's a big part of what economists can contribute in terms of understanding not only the climate change policy, but also the response to it or the lack of response. So thanks again for having me.
That's great. Thank you, Professor Shogren. So we're going to ask a couple of questions of our panelists just to get the conversation going. But again, I would encourage the audience as you listen to these discussions, please do use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. Great opportunity. You've got a lot of intellectual firepower here. They can answer just about every question, I'm sure, that you can think of. So with that setup, let's start with a fairly broad question for Professor Godby, and then we'll have the other panelists weigh in on it. But Professor Godby, if you can answer this, what effect is climate change having on Wyoming's economy today? And how do you see it impacting Wyoming's economy as the climate continues to change?
Sure. So first of all, how it affects the economy today or affects Wyoming more broadly today. I think a lot of the effects are yet to happen. If we think about those things that we attribute to climate change, how are things being affected right now? The most obvious ones are those climate effects. So we do know that over the past several decades, we've seen increasing temperatures here. We've seen higher instances of drought, and those have economic impacts in themselves. So for example, agriculture, we've had lower yields, potentially more drought, higher feed prices, for example, for the cattle that are raised in Wyoming. But we also see other things, right? We also see human health effects. So for example, With those warmer temperatures, we've seen the mosquito season lengthen. It's possible that we're seeing mosquitoes now and other insects that are carrying diseases that weren't as common previously. And so there are human health consequences here. Though just the heat also creates human health consequences. All of these things are expected to worsen over time. We've seen greater variability in the weather. Again, we attribute these things to climate change, and of course, those have had economic costs. The one thing that I haven't mentioned is energy. And while a lot of people think about energy and see climate change and energy as, kind of tied at the hip, really what Wyoming has been transitioning through in the fossil fuel realm is really probably much more to do, well, it's difficult to point to climate change as being a cause for that, although it is certainly a concern and a future uncertainty. There are potentially effects of those concerns that are affecting markets now, but broadly speaking, Wyoming's energy economy, which boomed in the first decade of this century, and then, over the past decade has really contracted, has primarily been driven by market changes and technological advances that really have nothing to do with climate change, at least in how they were developed, and more to do with, they may have effects though in the future with climate change. The biggest one, of course, being, the advent of widespread use of fracking and unconventional oil and gas extraction, which has greatly increased productivity of fossil fuel production elsewhere in the country. It's lowered prices in markets, and it's also made markets more competitive, and it's made it more difficult for Wyoming producers to compete. And that, of course, has had lots of impacts on Wyoming's economy, both in the private sector and in the public sector, since 50% in a typical year, as much as 70% in some years of our revenues for a general fund or our discretionary spending come from fossil fuel revenues. But is that climate change? No. Now in the future, the real question is, what choices might we make around fossil fuel use, and how might that affect the state? And of course, if you're talking about economics, it's still an unknown, but it is a very pressing threat that we think about a lot, and how we might adapt to it. So those are just some kind of preliminary thoughts about how climate change may be affecting Wyoming's economy, and I can pass it on to some of our panelists to add to kind of those thoughts.
Sure. Would anyone else like to jump in on that question?
Sure. I'll make 2 points, quite disparate. The first point sort of rests on some anecdotal evidence. Not that long ago, there was a running joke around here that Halloween would always be characterized by a blizzard. The kiddies in their costumes would be coming out trick-or-treating, bundled up like Michelin tire men to fight against the cold. That hasn't been true for a while, and indeed, it has been a long time since I can remember snow on the ground in early November. That used to be a given. The last few years, there hasn't been snow that stayed on the ground until December, which is to say that the seasons in which we expect to see precipitation have really been pinched. They start later, they end earlier, and a corollary to the latter part is that when they end, the snow melts rapidly. So you get this burst of water into the waterways, rivers, which matters to me as a fly fisherman, and then it tends to peter out. So if you have an economy, as this state does, that is tied to tourism and tourism related to freshwater sports like fly fishing is not a small part of the state's economy, this has an adverse impact. On the other side, and here's the kind of the disparate bit, I think what we are going to see over the course of the next 5 to 20 years is an increasing focus on things that can be done to mitigate the kind of the flow of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And a big part of that, I believe, is going to be carbon capture and sequestration, or possibly carbon capture utilization and sequestration. The distinction comes by whether you use the captured carbon dioxide to do stuff like enhanced oil recovery, or you just bury it underground. There are opportunities in this state. We've been using captured CO2 to enhance production of oil for not quite 40 years, but over 35. So this is something that we have some expertise with. The infrastructure is there to deliver the captured CO2. And so there's sort of a question about whether or not we can build out this particular theme. And to the extent we can, I think this will be an opportunity to make lemonade out of what might appear to some to be lemons.
Thank you for that. Dr. Khalaf, any thoughts that you'd like to add?
So I think like Dr. Godby and Dr. Mason covered everything really well. There's also sort of an increase, right, in the occurrence of wildfires. There's an impact on wildlife because the ecosystem is changing. And I think all these things are going to lead to an increase in sort of a government expenditure. So that's something that we should keep in mind as well.
Great. Dr. Godby, before we go to the next question, Jay, I'm going to throw the next question to you. But before we get there, Dr. Godby, I want to just tease out one thing you said that really struck me. So I come from a policy background. I lobby, I work on governmental programs. And it's always been my assumption that whether it's California standards on renewable energy, or the Pacific Northwest not wanting to do a coal export terminal, or federal incentives for solar and renewable, that government policy really is driving a transition in energy markets. And a lot of that government policy in turn is being driven by concern about climate change. It sounded like you were saying that's not really what's driving a transition away from coal or toward natural gas, or lowering the price of natural gas as much. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we could definitely, as Jay said, we could disagree. But from the research I've seen and the research I've done, those things certainly have an effect. Certainly if climate change was the concern over coal terminals, that could have been one of the reasons. Of course, as I looked at those problems, for example, using coal terminals as an example, a lot more of the debate I saw at the local level was really the disruption and the change that people were concerned about within their own local communities, for example, how it might affect the bays that were there, native lands, other things. To the degree that those are related to climate change, we might agree or disagree, but those were minor issues. I mean, and again, to use the coal terminals as the example here, the real reason that coal terminals probably didn't come about is because it's just not economic to do it. It's just too expensive, and the risk proposition there is incredible. Now, you could argue that part of that risk is the fact that if we build out a terminal that might have an expected 30 to 50-year life, investors won't go near it because they're concerned about climate change and they're worried about a stranded asset that just doesn't create the return on investment that they were hoping for. But going back to what I was saying before, there have been studies to suggest that, if we look at kind of the effects that have, say, affected the coal market, the majority of the effects that have affected the coal market and created this, really I don't think it's too strong a word to say the destruction of the coal industry, especially in certain areas. Christelle is definitely an expert on what's gone on in Appalachia. A lot of that has to do with just competition among fossil fuels. And really that, the advent of fracking and the use of unconventional methods and how that affected markets really occurred around 2008 to the 2010 time period. Gas prices crashed over the next decade, making gas just a much more appealing fuel for electricity generation, which is primarily what coal is used for. About 90% of it is used in electricity generation. And that really drove coal markets. Now, of course, there were potentially climate benefits if you compare coal versus natural gas, about half the CO2 emissions for the same amount of electricity produced, at least if you just look at the electricity being produced. And then there are other effects that are harder to tease out, are methane leaks and things like that around a more widespread gas infrastructure, better or worse. And studies have differed on that, although I think they lean towards even including those. The benefit over using gas versus coal has been positive. But again, that's kind of a second order effect. The primary thing that's really affected energy markets for gas versus coal has been technological shifts, and that's also really affected oil markets and the productivity in the United States, the amount of production. And again, this is kind of Chuck's area of expertise. But those are areas that, again, outside of any debate of climate change or whether it existed or not, I think would have been almost equally disruptive.
Interesting. Great. So before we're going to get to the Q&A that we have in the box, let me just take a look at those and see if there's any that we want to. I think we'll get to the Q&A at the end. We're going to go through a couple of moderator questions. I'm just going to invoke moderator's privilege. We'll ask a couple of these questions and then we'll get to the Q&A. So again, if you do have a question, please do put it in the Q&A box. Professor Shogren, so you've worked on the IPCC or IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Those reports have urged interventions that reduce pandemic and climate change risks while enhancing compound resilience, social justice, and biodiversity conservation. What interventions do you suggest will be effective in helping respond to climate change risks?
Well, as an economist, you're always skeptical about waiting for people to do the right thing at the wrong price. And we're essentially treating carbon CO2 release as a free good. And a molecule released here in Laramie has the same impact as a molecule released in Mongolia. And so what we have here is really a global public good in which we're all tied in, and there's not this nice separability between things that the free market likes and can operate on, and property rights are globally defined in that sense, which makes it hard to enforce and hard to monitor. And so in terms of interventions, economists either argue for trying to get the prices right by setting some kind of carbon tax, a green tax, or setting some kind of quantity constraint like a cap and trade system in order to actually put a price on the things that we don't want in order to reduce them. I mean, it goes back hundreds of years. I mean, economists have been arguing for Pigouvian taxes for a long time, and or green taxes or carbon taxes, whatever name you want to give them, but essentially to put the right price on what we're treating as a free good. And, economists getting involved in climate change probably started in the 70s with another Wyoming economist, Ralph Darge, who wrote one of the first reports on this, which then Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize for including climate change in economic growth models, basically, started at the same time. And that out from that grew the economists participating in the IPCC, which now is up to their 6th assessment here on this report. And there's a fine line between wishing good things happen and then actually making things happen. And so you can hear it in the news today, even the very more left-leaning news reports, when they talk about inflation and gas prices, are upset about the price of a gallon of gasoline. But for an economist, we're like saying, well, yeah, it should probably even be a little bit higher if we put a carbon tax on it. So this behavioral contradiction between, well, I've got to drive, I don't want to pay that much, but I want to prevent climate change, I still don't want to pay that much. And so how do you overcome those behavioral impacts and trying to get people to budge off their status quo to think about a long-term risk when there are these short-term transfers? And the short-term transfers, of course, they hit the wealthier economies in the pocketbook now. And any policy we do is, in some ways, a massive transfer of wealth to tomorrow's poorer economies because they're more affected by climate than we are in terms of their agriculture and forestry and harvesting and such. So it's a long way to say put a price on it, put a tax on it. Other people try nudges, but trying to frame the question so that people will do the right thing, that they're moderately successful for a moderate time until people figure it out. And I don't know, maybe that's our go-to button, is put a price on it. But we've been saying the same thing for most forms of pollution for the last 200 years. So we're saying it for a reason. It gets people's attention.
And obviously the federal government has not implemented a cap and trade system, although they got close a number of years ago in terms of a bill that passed the House. But the state of California has, and other countries have. How effective have they been at accomplishing their goals?
Well, say the European one is the longest running one for climate. And for a long time, the problem with their cap and trade system is there was so much supply of carbon permits due to trying to bring in all the countries to be involved that the price went down to near zero. That's changed now, though. The price is up to around 30 euros last I saw a month or so ago, maybe a little bit higher, with the idea that people are actually putting a value on the permits for carbon. And if that's the case and the constraints are actually binding, then it can work. Now, the challenge, of course, is, like I said, it's a global problem. The Chinese have to participate, the Russians have to participate, Brazil has to participate, the United States has to participate in these global markets, because you can only put your fingers in, if you can only put your fingers in half the dam and it's leaking on the other half, it's still leaking. So this is where the real challenge is, because it is a global public good.
What our other panelists, anyone want to jump in on interventions that will be necessary to respond to climate change?
So we have a saying. It's the kind of thing that would show up in the freshman level economics class. There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. You're going to have to pay for stuff one way or another. You might pay for stuff by having a carbon tax or some related kind of policy instrument, or you might pay for stuff by not doing anything and suffering the consequences. As Jay points out, those are mainly down the line, but it's important to be mindful of kind of the emerging features of day-to-day life. Christelle made a comment about wildfires. That used to be a thing in parts of the US. Now it's a big thing in the Western US. I can remember rarely seeing forest fires of any note in the Snowies, the mountain range just to the west of Laramie. The last 3, 4, or 5 years, there have been meaningful fires there, some of which kind of distribute the ashes and the smoke and such in such a way as to make life in this part of Wyoming seem almost apocalyptic. So, there's a case to be made for costs kind of being a lot closer to today than we used to think of these as being generations removed. It seems like the urgency is mounting, and accordingly the cost of inaction.
So if I can
Anyone else
jump in.
want- Oh,
Sure.
please do.
So I was going to say that interventions can sort of also take the form of research, development, and deployment of new technologies. So to Chuck's point, that can look like carbon capture. It can look like the investment in nuclear that Wyoming is currently doing. But also when we're talking about interventions, we can talk about sort of interventions towards mitigation and interventions towards just adapting to the change that is occurring. So looking at innovative irrigation systems to deal with drought, looking at ways to deal with wildfires that include controlled burns, that kind of stuff are also sort of important interventions, I think.
And just for the audience, what is the difference between mitigation and adaptation?
So mitigation is trying to decrease emissions, trying to decrease how much the climate changes, and adaptation is just sort of accepting that change is occurring and just trying to prepare for that change. So I think there's a statistic that says for every $1 invested in adaptation, we save $5 in the future in terms of losses because of climate change.
Great,
thank you.
I'd just
Professor
add
May-
a little bit to that. I think there's a
absolutely.
part to this debate that we haven't really mentioned yet. So in addition to, the ideas that have so far, and there's so many, I mean, if we want to talk about interventions, we could be here all night just categorizing what kinds there are. We've talked about the mitigation strategies to, create incentives or actually, laws. So for example, centralized regulatory frameworks that reduce the use of say, fossil fuels, for example, or reduce emissions. We can also talk about structural changes in the economy, how we can do planning that might change how the economy works or how we conduct our lives. Denser cities that might be more efficient, that allow public transport, things like that. We can talk about behavioral strategies. Jay mentioned nudges. And we can talk about, as Christelle said, technology. And those are just some of the ideas. But the other thing that I think we need to think about as we think about interventions and as we work together, as Jay said, this is a global problem. It has geopolitical aspects, but it also is local and it's individual, right? How do we get people to buy into this? And in the same way, if let's imagine that the European Union is doing a lot, but the United States and China aren't, we have a problem. What do you do if you're doing everything you can and your neighbor is doing nothing? We have those same sorts of issues as well. And then one that we really need to think about are just kind of the distributional consequences of any policy that we have, or just the distributional consequences of the effects of climate change. It affects different groups differently. The wealth that, and we can talk about just transitions or just policy around this. How do we address these inequalities? Whether we talk about it by nations, should we expect the poorer nations in the world to do as much as the wealthier nations that have contributed more to this over time? And similarly, what should we do about the fact that as we think about certain policies, certain groups will be impacted more than others? And how do we address that? There's a social choice to be made around what we think is fair. The ethics of these choices also matter. And so we really need to think about designs of policy and planning and what goals we're actually trying to achieve. And there will be multiple goals. And as we think about those things, they probably affect the likelihood that we might be successful at either mitigating outcomes, adapting to outcomes, or just creating a society that is better off while these outcomes occur to the degree that they might. And so I would say that, there is a lot of policy making, not just to do with whether we mitigate, but also how we adapt. And of course, in Wyoming and in the West and energy producing states, These are really important questions. As if we use kind of Wyoming as our laboratory, we may bear a lot more of the burden as a rural state that is somewhat older, more dispersed than, say, urban states. And you mentioned it, Brian, early on, those coastal states and the interior states, and how things affect each of them will affect how they make choices around local policies that may have regional or even national or global effects.
Great, excellent points. Others want to jump in on this conversation?
Yeah, well, this is Jay again. All of this works. I mean, we're balancing these long-term impacts against real-time current transitions. And Wyoming is right in the middle of it. And living through a transition time is no fun. You can try to get ahead of it, or you can try to be behind of it. But as I tell my students here, I said, well, try to convince everyone in the energy industry to change what they do. Either go find a new job or move into a different sector of the energy system. And those transitions are incredibly hard, especially for people my age, where you're like set and you've got everything set up. And how do you deal with that? Do you provide compensation? Do you provide subsidies? Do you provide training? Do you provide moving expenses? All those things that make these transitions easier, whether they're here in Wyoming or wherever they are. And that becomes, the current political question, in which, we can say in the US Senate, we can put up a bill back in 97 for Kyoto that said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to sign on, or we're going to ratify this treaty. And that bill, in a non-binding bill was 97-0, that the US would never ratify the climate treaty if China and India weren't participating in it. And so that's Democrats, that's Republicans, that's independents, in the sense that it is a global problem, and no one country wants to tie their arm behind their back when it comes to global trade, when it comes to global competitiveness. It's not like it's a zero-sum world here, but at the same time, why would you think you could get reelected if you're essentially putting yourself in a worse position? Scandinavian countries do it. They tax carbon. The Norwegians, the Swedes, the Finns, the Danes, but their population is much more involved in worrying about climate change than I would say ours.
Great. Well, let's pivot from that question to a question for Professor Mason, and everyone else obviously can chime in on it. But I'd like to think a little bit about global trends that are happening. And good Lord, there are a lot of changes happening in our world. What global trends do you think will influence Wyoming's labor and economy in the next 10 years? What are the things that are top of mind for you?
Well, I'm going to start off answering this question by assuming a certain trajectory for policies on a broad-based international level. Maybe not the global treaty that Jay aspires to, but something meaningful. I think what you're going to see over the course of the next decade are important pushes in the direction of things like renewable energy and away from conventional fossil fuels. There's an information service in Norway that had that I saw a webinar produced by not terribly long ago, that identified the fraction of electric vehicles, which they took to mean kind of plain vanilla EVs and plug-in hybrids. So it's a little bit broader than you might expect at first blush, but nevertheless, country by country, in the in that cohort of the national fleet of motor vehicles that was purchased new in the preceding year, and so this is 2021, the question is, what fraction are this broad version of electric vehicles? And the answer was remarkably large for several European countries, over a third in the UK, pushing a half in Germany, and bordering on incredulity would be my response to the answer for Norway, 91%. Let's just say that these numbers are off by a factor of 2. They're exaggerating the picture somewhat. Still, I think you're going to see this push in a direction that really plays to the importance of electrifying economies. Historically, that power might have been produced by a mix of various fossil fuels, maybe throwing some renewables in. Certainly in Norway, that's going to include hydro, but elsewhere, it's going to importantly include other kinds of renewable energy. I think that trend's going to continue. But there's this great big speed bump to the deployment of renewables. And we think a little bit about this, so we think a little bit about intermittency, by which most people mean over the course of a 24-hour period. The sun doesn't shine at night, except for Wyoming, the wind doesn't blow at certain parts of the day. Well, it turns out that the most important variation is not day to day, but over the course of the calendar year, and that the demands, the ability to produce renewable energy is massively larger in the summer than it is in the winter for solar, which on reflection makes sense, and also kind of the reverse for wind. And with those sorts of variations, something has to fill the gap. And I think it's kind of popular to imagine a world in which we go big on renewable energy. That only is going to make sense, going big on renewable energy. That's only going to make sense if and when we have some sort of a technology that allows large scale storing of electricity, and that doesn't exist now. There are ways to do it, but it isn't anything remotely the scale we need. Or having something else that fills in the gaps. And that something else that fills in the gaps, by definition, has to be reasonably flexible, has to be the sort of thing that you could imagine ramping up and down in fairly quick fashion. And by that virtue, it rules out nuclear energy, it rules out coal, it admits natural gas. So I'm hard pressed to see a world in which natural gas doesn't play something of an important role over the course of the next 10 to 15 years, particularly as we think about ramping up our ability to export gas, which comes by virtue of the liquefaction facilities that are popping up in various places in the country. I hope we have time to come back to the questions I'm seeing on carbon capture, because I'll just stick a pin in this. I think where carbon capture really becomes interesting and has legs is when it's applied to natural gas fired power. But let's hold that off to the side. This question begs for somebody to speak to current events in Eastern Europe. And so I'm going to accept that challenge. I think what we're going to see, honestly, I think we are going to see a very broad-based unpacking of relationships with Russian fossil fuels. I think that there'll be a diminution of the use of Russian oil. They'll still figure out ways to get it to market, but they'll have to eat a really big discount in order to do so. I think there's going to be a really big reduction in the use of Russian natural gas. And these are both opportunities for a variety of players to fill the gap, but in particular, folks in Wyoming. I mean, we aren't high on the pecking order for American tight oil and gas production, but I think we will be a player for these things. going forward. So that'll be the way in which stuff kind of comes home, especially to the extent that we see a build out of LNG, liquefied natural gas facilities, especially to the extent that domestic crude oil production increases, especially to the extent that we're able to mitigate some of the climate-related concerns like fugitive methane emissions and flaring concerns and carbon capture generally associated with electricity production.
Great response. Thank you so much. That's super interesting stuff, and the current trends, especially Eastern Europe, fascinating. I do want to get to the audience questions because we want to make sure we end the webinar on time, but I also want to just open up for the panel. Anyone want to build on Professor Mason's comments just now on global trends that you're seeing?
So I want to add an opportunity that I see, which I think is reshoring, right? Bringing back components of the supply chain back into the US. And I think an example that comes to mind for me is a project that SCR, the School of Energy Resources, is currently working on that we at the center are helping with, which is looking at the viability of a core CM industry in the state of Wyoming. And so when we're talking about core CM, these are sort of chemicals and elements that can be used to produce anything from photovoltaics that are used to build solar projects, also that can be used to build batteries for EVs, right? So anything basically that is needed for a greener economy or an economy that has less emissions. And so I think this type of project creates like real opportunities for Wyoming in terms of, having manufacturing here in the state. And so I think another thing that I want to mention is automation. And so when we're talking about automation, we're talking about displaced workers, right? And so there's this need for agile upskilling programs. And so I think that some of the investments that we're seeing in the state are really cool. So for example, the WIP initiative that is bringing together the University of Wyoming and the community colleges to look at how they can make sure that the residents of Wyoming have the skills necessary to be competitive in the labor market. I think that's cool. And I don't know if Dr. Godby wants to talk more about it.
Well, thanks for the plug. I agree with you. I think that so if the question is what global trends will influence Wyoming's economy in the coming years, Chuck hit a number of them. Christelle added some opportunities. I'd kind of go back to Chuck's comments before I talk about initiatives like WIP and labor force or economic diversification, things like that. I think Chuck and I agree and maybe disagree to some extent on some of these things, and that's fine because as far as I know, my magic 8-ball is no better than his crystal ball. But I think that as we think about things, there are some hopes and dreams, and then there's the reality of not only markets but of how much willingness there is for people to change. Then we add on top of that layers of geopolitical risk that we haven't been thinking about for the past decade or more, but certainly they've come roaring back. And we don't know that that's going to go away anytime soon now that, that's kind of out of the box. Natural gas, I think, so as I look at the trends, I think there is a real trend towards, absent the concerns around Ukraine and how that's changed things. Prior to that, there was a real trend towards reducing the use of fossil fuels in our energy system. I think that's going to continue. I think that's a regulatory trend that governments and people really do want to do more, and they're willing to accept more of the cost to do that. I think that's probably going to continue, at least absent other events that force them to reconsider that. I think, though, that Chuck's right that we aren't going to jump to renewables as quickly as we thought. So that's going to allow some industries in Wyoming to persist. I do believe, though, that once kind of current disruptions go away, there are some trends that we'll see continuing. The first one is the coal industry is really very challenged. Now, how that'll be affected with respect to alternatives in the future is a little difficult to predict right now, but there is actually real policy in place to eliminate coal as kind of the dirtiest fuel. And so far, carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage, really doesn't make that an effective fuel when you can consider the alternatives. Natural gas may be a bridge fuel for a while, but I think at some point that probably ends up going away as well. And we end up considering new technologies like hydrogen. That's a possibility, and certainly there's an opportunity there in Wyoming as well. The transportation sector is going to be a little harder to do just because of the installed capital that already exists. But it's really just a matter of how far are you looking out. Electrification of that sector could really change things. But oil extraction is going to continue probably long after that, because so much of it is used in the production of other materials, right? Petrochemicals are used in a lot of things. So I see energy production in Wyoming decreasing significantly for some of the reasons Chuck mentioned. We are more of a marginal player than we are the main event. There are places that have advantages over us. But I see it continuing, but declining, and those are going to matter. I also see effects in the agricultural sector that, due to climate change, that could make things very challenging here. In particular, droughts and how that works may really change. It's not a large part of our economy, but culturally it's very important. I see that affecting things as well. But most importantly, I see changes in our energy sector really affecting revenue, and that gets to Christelle's point, which is, what do we do about this? And certainly we've begun to do things at the university, across community colleges, economic development agencies, and the private sector. This so-called Wyoming, well, it's actually called, not so-called, Wyoming Innovation Partnership, that will really create connections to, encourage workforce development, but also economic diversification. But I'm also going to see other things occurring. So some trends that we haven't, one trend that we've seen elsewhere is a lot of policies towards climate change. And that's a trend I'll identify. In Wyoming, we haven't seen really a lot of policy in that direction. I do see in the future more economic development and workforce efforts to kind of cushion the transition that's occurring, and also diversify our economy. And I think also we're going to see more energy assistance programs, whether they're, weatherization or energy assistance, because we do have, this is, especially as energy prices go up, it will affect different people in different ways. And then I also think that we are going to see an expansion of technology. Wyoming is moving in this direction. If we have one policy that's kind of aimed this way, we've been trying to encourage technology development. But there may also be some kind of collective action initiatives, right? It won't just be government. It'll be conversations like this. It'll be grassroots level efforts that lead to things like distributed, say, solar projects, or collective renewable energy projects, other community efforts that might occur. And also, just how those changes in the economy will create new business development. So for example, as the coal industry contracts, there's opportunities there in the reclamation sector that could really potentially be pioneered in Wyoming and exported to the rest of the country or the world. So I see a lot of policy changes as well that'll be affected by these trends that are going on.
Let's talk about some of those policy changes. I know we have some questions from the audience. Kathy, what do you have that you can tee up? And I know some of these questions are on similar topics, if you want to bundle some of the questions in the interest of time.
Yeah, thank you to the panelists and Brian for this interesting and very important conversation, and to the participants who have submitted questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. The first question that came in has to do with net metering. Some Wyoming legislators here and in other states want to curtail the ability of people who have solar panels to benefit from net metering. If you are familiar with the net metering issue, please share your thoughts.
Okay, I'm up. This is a big deal in California. and some pretty smart energy economists have been thinking about it for a while now. So let me just make a couple of observations. Anywhere there's an electric grid, there are costs that the community, broadly writ, has to somehow cover. Those costs are there whether you produce all your electricity by rooftop solar or none of your electricity by rooftop solar. You, I, everybody else pays a little bit every month to cover those costs in your electric bill. If we let folks sell back to the grid at what we might think of as wholesale prices, this is the logic that my friends in California are using, then we're not providing a little slice there to help cover those possibly very large fixed costs. And this is going to encourage, so then the next step will be that somebody, now a smaller pool, has to cover those fixed costs. That's going to push their rates up and induce more people to go into rooftop solar, and the process repeats. They'll hearken this as a death spiral, and an easy way to work around that is to let folks sell electricity back, not at full price, but at something a little bit less. I think there's a pretty strong argument to be made for allowing that. I don't think there's at all a good argument to be made for not allowing any sale back into the grid. It's a source of power. What's not to like about that? So there's a certain amount of kind of protectionism, I think, that's built into the posturing that at least that I've heard from local state and local politicians. But there still is an argument to be made for having everybody kind of help pitch in, so to speak, to cover the costs associated with the grid. And that means that as regards reselling electricity into the grid, that you get something less than full freight.
So Professor Mason, I'm just going to ask a follow-on question on that. We have solar panels at our house in Sheridan, and it seems to me that on our electric bill, we have line charges that we pay, and then we have power charges. How aren't the line charges intended to cover that,
Yes.
that collective cost?
Yes, they are. Yeah. But by design, for the most part, and Rob, you probably should speak up to this if I go way off the reservation on this. For the most part, electric bills have those sorts of fixed charges that you're just referring to, plus variable charges, and the variable charges are inflated above and beyond the opportunity cost, the fuel cost, the generating costs of that electricity. And that's meant specifically to provide a little bit of extra net revenue, the difference between what you or I pay and what it costs the producer to generate that electricity, which helps then cover those costs. If we had only the fixed charges at a suitable level, then, and everybody was charged at whether they sat behind the grid with, kind of the homeowner produced electricity or not, we wouldn't have nearly as much of a problem. But that seems not to be the case in most every electric utility jurisdiction that I'm aware of. But this is really closer to Rob's wheelhouse than mine. So
yeah, so I think so without specifically commenting on a specific net metering policy, because they can be designed in a lot of different ways. Conceptually speaking, typical ones have a single net metering charge that, you effectively the price you get for electricity when you put it back. Let's just assume a simple one like that. And to Chuck's point, if more and more people decide that they're going to leave the grid, for example, or not cover their costs, and there are costs to net metering because it does change the dynamics of how the electricity system works, and that will change costs. And it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly as you work through an electricity grid and how costs occur. But a really simple one that isn't priced in a lot of net metering systems is the fact that if you have solar panels on the roof, most people have solar panels, but they don't have batteries. And so what effectively they do is they use the rest of the grid as their battery. And so they really do need that infrastructure. And to Chuck's point, if that infrastructure isn't covered, and in fact, the cost or the demands on that infrastructure will go up. And so you really have to design the system, and you can do it a number of different ways, but the bottom line is you need to be very careful about disincentivizing being part of the grid, because as the grid shrinks, there are fewer and fewer people that have to pay for that same infrastructure that expands across our communities. And so it becomes very difficult to balance those policies in different places. They can work in different ways. In a place like Wyoming, where we have vast distances and sparse populations, that infrastructure is pretty expensive and it's difficult to maintain. It's difficult to adapt to these sorts of uses. And so, you know, I think when people really get excited about net metering, it's either it will happen or it won't happen. And what really has to be considered is a lot more components of that charge. You could split out your bill so that there was actually a power charge and a line charge, but that line charge would have to change. And one of the problems with, if you want to call it a problem, one of the complexities of how we work our electricity systems is just the regulation built around a system that used to exist in the past, but may not exist in the present or the future. And so we're trying to adapt bills and how we do things to a regulatory structure that may not fit very well. And so how much can you change those charges? What can you charge for? What is the prevailing kind of utility law that applies here in your region, or how have commissioners and different utility commissions dealt with this in the past? So it becomes complicated very quickly. And so, you know, I think one of the problems is you're either for or against net metering is really another one of those examples where it's just too simple in a question for too complicated a system. And that becomes very, you know, in a world where people don't understand those complexities or don't want to hear them, the debate can get very difficult very quickly. And when people start bringing in the details, you know, those that are unfamiliar with them, their eyes can just roll back of their head and they disengage. So I think that's a little bit of some of the conflict as well.
So I know we're a little bit behind schedule now on the agenda, and that's my fault for not keeping us on task. But Kathy, why don't we do one more question, maybe on the carbon capture and utilization? I know we had a couple questions on that topic. Maybe bundle those together, and then we'll get to our lightning round. So maybe we can spend just 2 or 3 minutes on the carbon capture question.
Okay, if captured CO2 is used to produce more oil, doesn't it have an adverse effect? And is there any evidence that carbon capture and storage could economically compete with renewable energy, considering the exorbitant cost as detailed in the documents recently submitted to the Wyoming PSC by Pacific Court and Back Hills Energy, the relatively small fraction of Wyoming coal that goes to in-state power generation, and the aging, rapid retirement and lack of replacement of coal-fired power plants outside of Wyoming that might otherwise be eligible for carbon capture and storage?
Well, I think those are probably steered to me. So let me try to do this in a minute or so, maybe 90 seconds. So the effect, I think the first question that you blended here really has to do with a question about whether or not you get kind of an offset that eliminates any benefits associated with the carbon sequestration in the first instance. That has very much to do with what happens in oil markets with that extra oil produced. There's abundant evidence that other sources of supply will likely get displaced, so that there will be something like a greatly reduced effect along the lines that the first questioner was concerned about. As to whether or not it competes, well, we've been doing EOR in this state for, like I said, for many decades, and similarly in Texas. And so I'd say that's the market telling you that this is a source of electricity production or something that's attractive. The question really is, where does that CO2 come from? In Texas, they draw it from naturally occurring deposits in the Four Corners area. There's no climate gains there. In this state, there's what's called dirty natural gas that's produced up around Pinedale. That stuff that's been split out before the natural gas can go to market, that was just going to get vented. So capturing it and delivering it into a mature oil field has some pretty clear benefits. As to the other part of this, it's true that carbon capture is quite expensive. This has been a source of kind of intellectual inquiry for a long time now, decades. I think the fair point is there hasn't been much to motivate that research and development, aside from things like assisting with enhanced oil recovery. If you created a market, say by dint of having a meaningful carbon tax, I think you would see a lot of R&D steered into carbon capture. And if you believe in the analogy of learning by doing, it wasn't that long ago that solar power was massively outpriced, but experience drives these things down. And I think there's fair game here that we may see similar kinds of effects with carbon capture. But I'll let others speak now. I went over by a minute relative to what I was going to do.
Well, let me just chip in a little bit. I'd just say a couple of things really briefly. Carbon capture is too expensive right now to be affordable for coal. It was never developed to save coal. The two technologies are kind of separate. People in Wyoming have hoped one would save the other. It's possible in the future with the right incentives and with the right use and with value in markets that, if CO2 were commoditized and suddenly valuable, it could work. But I'm skeptical that coal CCS will ever really work. And then you add the regulatory system here where, especially our biggest utility, PacifiCorp, serves 3 states that really don't want to use that kind of power, and they've regulated it out of their markets. And as I think your questioner asked or commented on, the way the cost share would work then, we really can't afford it, the impact that unless that cost went way down. Where I really see possibilities for CCS is in industrial applications, those things that we still need, things like cement, other materials that where carbon capture could really work. And as Chuck said, the economics could work a lot better around natural gas, where you only have about half the emissions that coal does to deal with for the same amount of electricity. And so it's possible that it could be out there, but it's a long ways away. Where the technology stands right now, it is certainly experimental. It's tested, but not perfected for certain. And it is still very expensive.
Kathy, do you want to ask the question that we had on nuclear power before we go to a quick lightning round?
Yes, I would. What are your collective thoughts on the Natrium Advanced Reactor Project, and how will that affect our economy?
Well, in broad strokes, obviously it'll create jobs in different sectors. It'll bring back an interest in uranium mining, and it'll bring back the debate on storage of waste material. The question is, what does it do for our economy? It'll help the southwest corner, will it help the rest of the state? Well, it depends on how we decide to adjust our tax rates. Right now, we get 50% of our public goods paid for by severance taxes, and it's not clear that the same sort of tax policy is going to work. I know when they talked about the Endow project and they ran the general equilibrium input-output economic models, they found that diversifying the economy lowered state GDP, which made sense if you thought about diversifying the economy and not having any sort of tax base, but attracting people who still demand public goods at a higher rate in order to meet these new industries. So any sort of industrial change like that is also has to consider the change in the tax system as well in order to counterbalance in both the pros and the cons of this transition.
Anyone else want to weigh in on that that particular question?
Well, I'll just give you a little throwaway answer here. While we were still interested societally in nuclear power and we're building up our weapons portfolio, there were only a handful of states that were meaningful producers of uranium, and Wyoming was right up in the top of that list, always kind of in the top 3, often the top producing state in the country. Which is a hint that this could be a line of commerce in a different world in which nuclear energy had a renaissance.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, I guess if we're talking about the Natrium plant in particular, the irony here is as it's currently suggested as a design, it's not going to use Wyoming uranium. In fact, it was going to use Russian uranium. So there's a little bit of a problem here, and we don't have infrastructure in the country to actually enrich our uranium right now, although people have currently are acting in Congress to change that. It's an interesting project. It's yet to be determined. It certainly, as Jay said, it will affect just by the nature of the project and its scale. It will affect the southwest corner of the state significantly. How it affects the rest of the economy, we're going to have some tough tax questions, as Jay said. We made a choice in the last legislative session not to tax the production there. But it also is a test reactor, right? Unless we build more of those reactors in the state, what they're talking about is using that as a model to build around the world. And so it's a little uncertain whether that will create significantly more jobs other than just at the plant, or will the head office of a large R&D company continue to be located, for example, in Washington? It's a difficult question. Certainly it creates potential opportunities, but it also certainly creates some challenges. They're too long to mention that people get concerned about around nuclear power. But one of them is just, we're a long way away from that plant being developed and built, even though it has a relatively short time frame. And so there's a lot of question marks yet that need to be answered before anything really happens. So a lot of it is at this point speculative.
All right, with that, this has been a great conversation. We're going to go to our lightning round. I want each of the panelists to imagine that Governor Gordon is visiting the University of Wyoming, and you've just gotten into an elevator with him, and you're going up 2 floors. So you have a very short amount of time to tell him something you would like him to know, either about climate change, our response to climate change, or Wyoming's energy future. Let's start with Jay Shogren. Jay, go. What do you say to Governor Gordon?
Well, are you up for renaming the snowy range the rainy range? Because that is the prediction, that in the next 50 to 100 years, the snowy range out here and west of us will turn into the rainy range, because any further delay in participating in this global action, both in adaptation and mitigation, we're going to miss an opportunity.
All right, that is great, and it's a compelling image. Dr. Khalaf, let's go to you next.
I would say that we can mitigate climate change while pursuing economic development, and that adaptation to climate change will require public spending. So we need a tax structure in place that can support that.
All right, Professor Godby.
I think if Governor Gordon was getting in an elevator, or I was in the elevator already and the door's open and he was about to come in, I think he would probably turn the other way and wait for the next one. And he knows what I would talk about. 2 things. Christelle's already mentioned one of them. Our tax structure is not suited for whatever economy may come. It's not suited, currently we have a crisis and that revolves around energy. So if we're going to deal with our energy future, we have to deal with our tax structure, and we have to widen it. We have to reconsider it. And to be honest with you, it means in Wyoming, this isn't very popular. We're going to have to consider paying more taxes or having fewer public goods. The other thing I would just mention to him, though, is, and we have talked about this, is the opportunities Wyoming has of not being standing against climate policy, but really thinking about climate policy. So some of that is just accepting the trends that are occurring and adapting to those, as Christelle said, implementing policies around workforce development in a more significant way like other states have. But also, and I do encourage this, we're going to need all the solutions. And so there are opportunities here for technology. And I think that the governor is well aware of them. How they're being sold, we might disagree. But I do think that Wyoming can be a place where a lot of different technologies to try to solve this problem could be developed. And I think he's well aware of that.
Fantastic. Professor Mason, you get the last word in the elevator.
Okay. Apparently a whole lot of people got on and off at the first floor while Rob was on the elevator. Mr. Governor, the hydrogen economy is coming, and it's a really energy intensive fuel. Something's going to have to be readily available that can produce it at scale. That something could be natural gas, but that's only going to be true if you can figure out a way to deal with the fugitive methane emissions and the CO2 emissions that come associated with burning it. I think carbon capture is that answer. Have a nice day.
Fantastic. Let me, before I hand it back to Madeline, let me just thank all of you, the panelists. You guys have been so gracious with your time, and we very much appreciate all that you do for the state of Wyoming and the service that you give to the University of Wyoming, and especially to our students. You are a real asset to our state, and we very much appreciate it. I'd also like to thank the Wyoming Citizens Climate Lobby. You guys are doing great work, and this type of public platform and public discourse is just critical, not just for climate change, but for a healthy, functioning democracy. So thank you for that. And with that, Madeline, it's been a great honor to moderate. Let me pass back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Brian. We really appreciate your help and all of the panelists tonight. On behalf of Wyoming Citizens Climate Lobby, thank you to our panelists, our moderators, and our audience. Thank you so much. Our next chapter meeting of Wyoming Citizens Climate Lobby is May 11 at 7 p.m. And to join, contact laramieccl@gmail.com, and we'll get you the Zoom link to join us. And we also have a workshop scheduled, a Zoom workshop with MIT Climate and Economy Simulator scheduled for May 9, that's Monday, May 9 at 7 p.m. This hands-on workshop will help you to manipulate policy levers and witness complex systems dynamics. It's a lot of fun. We've done it a few times, and this will be led by Mary Keller. So we hope to see you at these future events, and thank you very much, you all, for coming tonight.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.